Welcome to the second part of this two-part video lecture on visualization. We're going to start by looking at some principles for how to design visual content.
The first principle is that every graphical element, such as colors, lines, patterns, etc., should convey meaning. What that means is that every color choice, every line you draw, every pattern you use should convey information. It should be used to highlight the data or to convey what you want to say to the reader. You shouldn't use colors, lines, patterns, etc. to just decorate your image. Principle number 2. Every graphical element adds weight to the illustration. So use only as much weight as you absolutely need. Weight is used in the abstract sense here. And this ties in with principle number 1. So the more minimalist you are in your illustrations, the easier it will be for the reader to process the information and to get to the data. Principle number 3. White space can be used to separate elements or add emphasis more efficiently than additional weight. So this ties in with both principle 1 and principle 2. So white space is basically just empty space. So you can use empty space to separate things and to make things stand out more clearly. And this is preferable to using to adding stuff to your illustration. Again, because it makes it more efficient and it makes it more aesthetically appealing. Principle number 4. Every illustration should be intuitive enough to be comprehensible without explanation. So if you need to explain your illustration, you should probably revise it. The basic gist of what you want to convey should be immediately or almost immediately visible to the reader. Principle 5. Use colors, but use them sparingly. To emphasize and separate specific elements where white space isn't enough to accomplish this. So if you use colors sparingly, as opposed to colorizing everything, then the colors will stand out more, and that makes them more useful to highlight and to separate things. Principle number 6. Guide the eye towards the most central parts. So by using different design layouts and by looking at, for example, a classical painting, you can learn the techniques that you use to guide the eye, using lines and by putting specific things in specific places. I'll show you this by using an example in a little while.
What happens when you apply these principles in actual illustrations? Next up, some good examples.
So the first of our good examples is bar graphs, but Tufte style. Consider first of all this default bar graph from LibreOffice. It looks roughly similar to other default bar graphs that you might get from Excel, for example. Note here that many of these lines, boxes, and digits are unnecessary, and the ticks can be replaced by white space, and low contrast colors can be used to reduce weight. Or you can just remove colors altogether. So if we take this as our first step, you can see that we have already eliminated a lot of unnecessary weight from this illustration. And then you can remove even more weight by removing the line at the top and the line at the far right, and just having the line at the left and the bottom. If you want to go full Tufte, you can even remove the line to the left and just have the baseline. And then you can add values for 5, 10, and 15% because you don't really need to add everything in between. That will give you enough information to be able to read this chart. And here Tufte also uses white space as opposed to lines to make it easier to compare the different bars to each other. Guiding the eye. So the idea here is to draw suspicion towards particular witnesses in a trial. This illustration was used in a government trial where a number of persons from organized crime were involved. So, as you probably can tell immediately, the weight in this picture is in the middle, where the person Polisi is represented, or his crimes are represented, to be more specific. So Polisi is in the middle here for a reason. And also note that the worst crimes are at the top and bottom. Also note how thick the X's are. The idea here is to make the jury think that Polisi is an unreliable witness. And they do this by making the X's as thick as possible to really draw the eye in and to specifically highlight Polisi because he was an important witness. And then when the jury starts to read this chart, they will start at the top and perhaps skip down to the bottom. That's why the worst crimes are at the top and the bottom. So they will immediately associate, consciously or subconsciously, these witnesses, and specifically Polisi, with murder, attempted murder, heroin possession, cocaine possession, marijuana possession, sexual assault on a minor, pistol whipping a priest, etc. Even though Polisi has no X's on the murder, attempted murder, and sexual assault of a minor, for example, categories, your eye is constantly being drawn in towards the middle. So your impression of Polisi will probably be quite poor after you've studied this chart for a while. Here's an example of how to use colors. The purpose here is to make a complex drawing easier to read. So as you can see, by having the entire drawing in a kind of very mild grayscale with fairly clear contrast, no shadowing and such. And then you use red to separate the lines and the numbers. So even though this has a lot of detail, you can very easily tell where the numbers are, and you can easily identify specific parts and compare them to a list. This is a very clever example of how to use colors as for contrast. So also note that the grayscale that is used here with very low weight. You have thin lines and you have gray rather than black. That emphasizes the red. It makes the red stand out more and makes it easier to read. So don't always use black and white. Remember that gray and white and dark gray tones against white can also be very efficient and much easier to read. Here's an example of how you can improve an illustration by adjusting the weight ratio and the colors. So in the top example, you see the original marshalling signals illustration. And below that, you can see Tufte's version of it, where he has reduced the weight and added colors in a way that makes it easier to immediately draw the eye towards the most crucial points. So weight here can be reduced by thinning the lines, removing the boxes around each of these figures, as well as eliminating unnecessary white space, and instead using the existing white space more efficiently. And then finally, as previously stated, the contrasting colors help you emphasize the important parts without adding weight. It makes it much easier to navigate this visually and to focus on the important parts. Here's another example. This is to show you that custom units, instead of given units, can improve the legibility of a fairly complex illustration, such as this map. So instead of using given geographical units, such as existing municipal borders and county borders and something like that, this map uses square kilometer units. That means that each unit is exactly the same size as every other unit. So this eliminates the issue of having arbitrary geographical divisions and then averages that are different in physical space, which might interfere with the presentation. So this makes it much easier to get a correct impression of the data that is being conveyed. And the data that is being conveyed here is population density for all categories of people. So on the left hand, you can see that the population density is very high in this urban region. Whereas in the right illustration, you can see that the population density of children is quite different. So what this tells you is that a very large number of children, so families with children, live in suburbs as opposed to in the city center, whereas single people tends to spend more time either living in the city center or commuting into the city center. And this is perhaps, according to Tufte at least, the best visualization ever made. And this shows Napoleon's Russian campaign, and this illustration is from 1845. So what is so remarkable about this illustration is that it gives you immediate visual access to no less than 6 dimensions of data. And these are army strength, the direction that the army is traveling, its location at a specific point in time on a 2-dimensional map, its river crossings, which have a significance of their own, as well as temperatures and time. So all these 6 dimensions can be read quite easily on this illustration if you know what it shows you. So if we start at the left, where the brown line is at its thickest, that shows you the size of Napoleon's army as it moved out, headed towards Moscow. And then the brown line thins out gradually as they get ever closer to Moscow. And you can also see that a part of the force leaves the main force and goes in another direction. And that is the thin brown arm that stretches upward and to the right. And once they are at Moscow, the color switches over to black. And that helps you to see the size of the force as it moves back away from Moscow. And you can see how it keeps getting thinner and thinner and thinner. And you can also see where the force that split early in the campaign rejoins the main force. And that is when the black line goes from Polotsk and down and rejoins the main force. And then you can see the impact of the river crossings, because the line gets thinner with each river crossing. And then finally, when we're back at the left side of this illustration, we can see the tiny portion of this army that actually made it back. So the disastrous effect of this campaign is immediately obvious in this illustration, and that is one thing that makes it so great.
We've seen bad examples, good examples, we've talked about principles and the life factor. And that's all I had for this video lecture on visualization. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have found it useful.